I'm very excited right now. There's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that as I film this channel has 310 subscribers. It's just weird to me that there are now over 300 people who have not only found my channel, but also deemed it interesting enough to actually click that subscribe button. So if you're one of those subscribers, thank you so much. Let me know down below how you found me. What was my first video you watched? And if you're not a subscriber, well, thanks for watching anyway. Another reason I'm excited is that you may have noticed that I have a new logo. The idea behind this one is a mon, or kamon, which is like the Japanese version of a family crest. Kamon are generally either flowers or geometric shapes in a circle, as opposed to all the heraldry Europeans got up to. Obviously, I'm not Japanese, so I don't actually have a kamon. So I just designed a brand new one. The hexagon is an abstract representation of a D20, because obviously I love D&D. But on top of that, it's a dice, a random number generator. So that makes it a great logo for a channel that's all about covering a cornucopia, a kaleidoscope of nerdy topics. Inside it is the shape of a book, because reading, writing and learning are kind of a big deal on this channel. And it's purple for the exact same reason as the previous logo. It represents ultraviolet, the 8th color, which is invisible but powerful. And that makes it my favorite color. The third reason I'm excited is because this is the first of a series of videos. This will be a trilogy on a topic I've been working on for years now. And these videos will contain most of the stuff I learned in that time. This trilogy is a crown on years of nerdiness, so you'll have to forgive me for being a little bit proud. Hello there, I'm Simon, welcome to my channel. And welcome to the first episode of Magic Squares and Me, the series where I tell you pretty much everything I know about Magic Squares. There's a link to the playlist right here, but since this is the first episode, it might be a little empty right now. In this first episode, I want to go over the history of Magic Squares, what they actually are, and why they are considered magical. But before I do, I want to talk a little bit about how this series came to be, and since it's my channel, that's what I'm gonna do. If you want to skip all that and get straight into it, first of all, rude. But I do understand. So if I remember to, I'll put a timestamp right here, so you know exactly how far to skip. Assuming anyone is still watching this part, story time. This whole thing started all the way back in high school. I think it was at the start of my senior year, when I stumbled across a YouTube video. I mean, that's what YouTube is for. But the video in question was an episode of a show called Scam School, the only show dedicated to social engineering at the bar and on the street. It was a weekly show on YouTube, hosted by the love child of Teller and Gal from Street Fighter. And the premise was to teach puzzles, proposition bets and magic tricks to help you win drinks at the bar. The show has changed a lot since then, but it's still around, except these days it's called Scam Nation. I very much recommend it. Now, this specific video taught a simple trick where the audience would randomly generate a number, and then the performer would create a 4x4 magic square that adds up to that random number, in every row, column and a whole host of other ways. Go watch the video if that's too vague for you. In fact, go watch it anyway. Now, you may have guessed that I'm somewhat of a nerd, so when I found out about a mathy nerdy trick like that, I loved it. But I did find myself thinking that it was a little limited, because it only works with a 4x4 grid, and spoiler alert, the random number isn't actually that random. So I started wondering if it would be possible to do this with a grid of any size the spectator names, and with any sum they name. I found some stuff online, but there was no general method that works on any size and any sum. So obviously, I decided to figure it out myself. I knew it was ambitious, and I had no reason to think I would actually succeed, but somehow I did. It took me a couple of years to fully figure it out, but in the end, I learned how to actually do it. And I'll teach you how to do it in episode 2. At that point, I had already succeeded in doing what I set out to do. But I also knew that I should probably compile all of this in a manual or something. If only so I wouldn't forget it myself. Especially because some of the techniques I use are my own original developments, meaning if I forget them, there wouldn't be any books or anything where I could retrieve or check the information. So I wrote a manual with everything I knew about magic squares. I'll go more in detail in episode 3, but I recently managed to automate the entire process, and I actually made a website allowing you to generate magic squares of any size and sum you want, with just a click of a button. I'll leave a link to that site below, as well as a link to download the rewritten manual. I should warn you though, that this series will cover the exact same stuff, just in video format. So if you don't want spoilers, this is your alert. Now without further ado, let's get into it. Let's start by defining what a magic square actually is. A magic square is essentially a grid of numbers, and of course it always has as many columns as it has rows. That's what makes it a square. What makes it magic is that it's filled with numbers, all different, usually consecutive, though that's not a requirement, and those numbers are distributed over the grid in such a way that the sum of all the numbers in each row, column and diagonal will always be the same. But that only makes them a mathematical curiosity. What really makes them magical is their relationship to the esoteric. The first magic squares are found in China, in a book called the Tatai Li Chi, something along those lines. I'm pretty sure I butchered the pronunciation. Anyway, that book was written in the 1st century of the Common Era, and it's like an encyclopedia of ancient rituals and philosophy. The book makes the analogy between the 3x3 magic square and the 9 halls of the Cosmic Temple, which is apparently where early emperors would perform rituals. So right from the start, it's clear that the interest in magic squares had little to nothing to do with mathematical curiosity, and more with symbolism and superstition. The 9 halls magic square is usually called the Lo Shu magic square. The reason is an ancient legend, because of course it is. Around 2100 before the Common Era, China was apparently ruled by an emperor called Yu. At some point during his reign, the land was hit by a deluge, after which the emperor was walking by a river called the Lo. In that river, he found a shu, a turtle. In itself, that's not that weird, but what made it remarkable is that on its shell, it had a bunch of dots, arranged like the 9 halls magic square, according to legend. Regardless of its origin, the Lo Shu magic square, as well as some other grids that are based on it, became significant in Feng Shui. That actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, magic squares are all about a harmonious distribution on a grid, so the link with Feng Shui is kind of obvious. Specifically, a school of Feng Shui called Flying Stars was developed, where the numbers represent yin and yang. And from that, philosophers also came up with tools for divination, like divination bands. So the Chinese were the first, but they were not alone. Both the Islamic and the Vedic worlds knew about magic squares and used them in ritualistic ways. They mainly used 3x3 and 4x4 magic squares, but those appear all over the place. In the 1st century of the Common Era, there was an alchemist who wrote a book called Kaksaputta, and it was all about 4x4 magic squares. There is also the Pashvanatha temple, which has a 4x4 magic square called the Yaina Square. This is one of those magic squares that adds up to the magic sum, not only in the rows, columns and diagonals, but also in a lot of other groups of 4. Of course, all of this is in the Orient. But what about the Occident? Well, you may think the first to play around with magic squares were the ancient Greeks, probably Pythagoras. And in a way, they were, but not in the way you may think. Pythagoras certainly doesn't seem to have cared about them. In fact, I haven't found any evidence at all of ancient Greek scholars studying magic squares. However, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Greek culture lived on in the Eastern Roman Empire, aka Byzantium. And the first Western mention of magic squares comes from a Byzantine scholar called Manuel Moschopoulos. And So the first mention in the West was in fact an ancient Greek, from a certain point of view. Anyway, in 1315 of the Common Era, Manuel published a treatise about magic squares, which was probably inspired by the Arabic scholars, because that's kinda how that went. Still, that's about as far west as magic squares went for a while, because Western scholars in the Middle Ages were more interested in scripture than mathematical curiosity. And I'm sure the esoteric interpretations didn't exactly help magic squares become popular in the West. And then the Renaissance happened, and pursuing knowledge for its own sake became a lot more acceptable. Around 1500 of the Common Era, one of the most influential mathematicians was Luca Pacioli. He actually wrote a book called De Viribus Quantitatis, or On the Power of Numbers, all about mathematical curiosities and mathematical tricks, several of which have actually made their way onto Scam School already. So it's no surprise that he also mentions magic squares. In that section, Luca shows the 7 planetary magic squares, saying that they play a role in astronomy. But he doesn't actually say how. To know that, we need to look at magical handbooks like De Occulta Philosophia by Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, from 1510 of the Common Era. Agrippa says that every planet has certain characteristics and aspects in life that it influences, and every planet also has a magic square assigned to it, which means that these magic squares can then be used in rituals to make the association with this planet and call on its magic. Something like that. One planetary magic square I want to share is the 4x4 square, which belongs to Jupiter. This very closely resembles the magic square that appears in Albrecht Dürer's Melancholia 1. But more importantly, also the magic square that is used in the trick as it is taught on Scam School. These days, magic squares are still used in symbolic and sometimes ritualistic ways, but their main purpose nowadays is recreation. They sometimes appear in artworks like the Sagrada Familia or the Lost Symbol, but they are also closely related to Sudokus. I mean, technically Sudokus are not magic squares, but they share a lot of characteristics. They're cousins. But now that we've arrived at the modern era, it's about time to wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed the first episode. Stay tuned for episode 2, where I'll teach you how to actually make a magic square. Something tells me that's gonna be a long video. In the meantime, everything else you can do to help the channel is in the end screen as usual. If you want to correct anything I said or add some extra knowledge, feel free to do so down below. I'll see you in episode 2. For now, thanks for watching.